President Donald Trump has made it clear that he wants to wrap up the war in Iran soon, but he also does not want to exit before achieving his stated objectives. Now, Trump himself has set a deadline for this, which is 2 to 3 weeks.
I can say tonight that we are on track to complete all of America's military objectives shortly, very shortly. We are going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong.
But Trump's speech did not offer any specifics about the next course of action. He also did not talk about the ground operations, but experts believe that signs are there. Even as he talked about wrapping up the war, thousands of U.S. Special Operation Forces were en route to the theater of war. Iran's military leadership says that it is already preparing to counter any method of attack. Listen to this.
With trust in Almighty God, this war will continue until your humiliation, disgrace, permanent and certain regret, and surrender. In continuation of the heavy and severe blows you have received so far, expect even stronger, await our more crushing, broader, and more destructive actions.
Now, hours after Trump's speech came the first sign of escalation. An attack on Iran's tallest bridge, the first official strike on civilian infrastructure in Iran. Trump soon issued his next warning. U.S. forces have yet to begin destroying what's left in Iran. He said that more of the country's bridges and energy infrastructure were in his sights. And to use his exact words, bridges next, then electric power plants. He also offered a way out to Iran once again, saying that Iran's new regime leadership, it knows what has to be done, and it has to be done fast. While Trump's rhetoric on Iran grew sharper, this also indicates an urgency. Rising fuel prices, falling numbers, and growing discontent among public means that Trump also needs to end the war. A Times report citing his advisors and members of Congress says that Trump is looking for an off-ramp. And for more on this, we're now being joined by Jennifer Ewing. She's a spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. And we also have with us Anne Elizabeth Mutet. She's a columnist, the London Telegraph. Thank you so much both for joining us on the broadcast. We're looking at two sharply different readings of President Trump's strategy here, whether this is a pathway to exit or if it's a prelude to escalation. Let me start with that core divide. Jennifer, I'm curious to know what you made of President Trump's address yesterday. He's clearly stated that the conflict will drag on for another 2 to 3 weeks, in which Iran would be hit pretty hard and taken to the Stone Ages. This is what he said. And if Iran does not agree to negotiations. In your assessment, is President Trump trying to create the conditions for an exit here? Or are we actually seeing the early stages of a much deeper military push?
Hi, thanks for having me. As somebody who was not in favor of these actions having begun in the first place, I truly hope and believe that the speech the other night was a signal that he's going to begin to shut the war down. As you said, he said, another 2 to 3 weeks. And I think the reasons why that could be happening, despite the fact that we are seeing, increased amounts of U.S. troops go into the region, is for a couple of reasons. One, he will know by now that this war is wildly unpopular, and not just with Americans in general, but even with the Republican Party. It's becoming less and less popular. I think it's, like 30% of the people are in favor of this. And once you mention any sort of ground troops, that goes down to something like 12%. And, if you say a major invasion, it goes down to 8%. So this is not popular. I think a lot of those polls were hidden from him for a while. And one bit of hope that I've seen over the last 24 hours is his chief of staff, who he listens to quite a bit, Susie Wiles, has even been concerned that the president has been surrounding himself with people who have been showing him, rose-tinted glasses, i.e. very positive views of this war. So that's number one. Number two, he has he has a meeting planned in Beijing, China, with President Xi. I believe it's the second week in May. So I think he wants a lot of this behind him before he goes there. We also have King Charles visiting the United States the last week in April. So those are a few things that I think he would want this wound up for. So while, again, I was hoping we never got this far in the first place, we are where we are. And if we can, unwind this as quickly and as, harmlessly as possible, that would be a good thing.
Right, Jennifer, we hear you, and while you think it could perhaps be heading towards an exit here, and do you see any evidence of that at all? Or do things point the other way, perhaps by mentioning the time frame of the previous wars and the extensive engagements? Could Trump be preparing domestic and the global audience to brace for a wider conflict here? And what's your assessment of this here?
Well, my first assessment is where the war is right now and what effect the war has on the wider world as opposed to on Iran. And the wider world is now headed to an economic crisis if something is not be done to stop the stranglehold that Iran has on the Straits of Hormuz, because that prevents the rest of the world receiving not only merchandise but energy, which is really the most important part. So it's a really dicey and delicate moment, especially since there's absolutely no reason why Iran should be blocking the Strait of Hormuz. It doesn't belong to them. They are on one side of it, and Oman is on the other. And world navigation is now facilitated for 5 countries only, which include Russia and China, and the others have negotiated. And it's a situation that's really probably one of the important point of the war. Iran does not have the means to resist this war in the other ways globally than to do this, because their capacity to use missiles and to attack the rest of the world has been depleted. I'm not saying it's ended, and I'm not saying they haven't got different resources, including terror networks, but it still is an important thing. So I think President Trump is briefed by very competent people who've been briefed him from the start. Once he decided that he would go on that, he had all the choices and he had all the capacities. Right now, what he's doing is he's sending points to a dual track strategy, which is putting a lot of pressure while leaving a narrow exit open. And what I would say is he doesn't want to lose. He doesn't want people to say Trump always chickens out, which is, tico, which is really something that he doesn't want to hear. But as Jennifer laid out, he's got a number of pressures, sorry, at home and abroad. That means that he needs to get to a second phase, whatever the second phase is. What we see in terms of the war being extended, part of it is already happening, which is sort of sending more means, having a large armada, a large fleet around, so that the capacity to wage more of a war is possible.
Absolutely, and this is where I would also like to bring in Jennifer, because
yes,
there are reports of a substantial troop movement towards the region as we speak, and you don't move thousands of troops to the theater of war and not use them. Would it be wrong to speculate that perhaps President Trump is just, buying time here in the guise of negotiations to get these troops in place in Iran and also make good on the claims that he's been making, Jennifer?
I've heard that argument, and I think it's very valid, to move the 82nd Airborne, to the Middle East, and some of these other ships that are on their way or are already there. That's not cheap. That's incredibly expensive if it was just, in fact, a hedge if things went wrong. However, this is President Trump that we're talking about, so he will often, say one thing and do another. But I still go back to the fact that this war is becoming more and more unpopular, and even in the Republican Party and the so-called Trump coalition, many of whom voted for no new wars. And this, once you start talking about ground troops, I mean, you're into the single digits as far as popularity. So I just, and perhaps I'm being naive here, I do not see not only what he hopes to accomplish. What are we going to do? take Karg Island and then start to see, the body bags getting shipped back to the United States. It's a terrible look. And, other wars that he mentioned that had gone on longer, that was a very strange, sort of way to lie this up, did show me, however, that in the past, when the president has done surgical things like he did in June, where it was in and out, and the so-called 12-day war, where they were destroying, apparently obliterating the Iranian nuclear capabilities, that was fairly accepted by the U.S. people because it wasn't troops on the ground, it was surgical, there was a reason. Likewise, in 2020, when Soleimani was assassinated, people thought that was going to be the start of World War III, and in fact it wasn't. There was very measured blowback by the Iranians. So again, once you put these troops on the ground, that is not something people voted for. And what are you hoping to accomplish? This is existential for the Iranians. It's not for the United States of America, quite frankly. It's not.
Right, but as we speak, the threshold for what is acceptable and what is not is also being shifted, because now we're hearing about bridges being attacked, energy sites, and also industrial infrastructure being in the line of fire. And that clearly marks a shift in the nature of this conflict. And once civilian infrastructure becomes a target, is there really any credible off-ramp which is left? And what's your take on that?
My take on this is that the rhetoric is inflammatory, and enough inflammatory that the image would be very bad if suddenly nothing of this happens. Because my feeling is that he wants to scare, certainly in any negotiation, he certainly wants to scare the other side and saying, I will consider everything. The movement of troops are important. There are movements that we haven't seen yet, but they may not be broadcast. What would signal a land operation would be the pre-positioning of field hospitals, supply depots, fuel pipelines, even planning for civil affairs. I'm not sure that would be the case. Karg Island is an interesting compromise because Karg is really sort of essentially preventing Iran from having income. And right now, Iran has more income than before the war started, just mechanically because the price of the oil has more than doubled. And that's in itself is important. But I also think, and this is where I start disagreeing with Jennifer, I think Americans may not like the idea of this war. They certainly didn't like the idea of a protracted war. Nobody would. But I also think that they do not like the idea of defeat. And believe me, the rhetoric around the world, not just Iran, but all the BRICS, all the global south, and some countries in the north would say America has lost, it's got egg on its face, it cannot succeed on anything, glory to Iran. And that is not something that would help President Trump in the forthcoming midterm elections.
Right, and both of you have raised some very interesting points here, but of course we understand that once the conflict reaches this stage, it often takes a momentum of its own and expanding in terms of the consequences and also the scope. And it can expand further than the initial intention or the expectations. But of course, we'll have to wait and see how this, evolves from here. But for now, thank you so much both for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your perspectives with us.